So many years ago, in another lifetime, I worked as a political consultant in the US political world. As a media consultant, actually, for a guy running for Congress. And I was asked to ghostwrite an opinion article on behalf of my client, basically opposing immigration. Now here's the funny thing. I am an immigrant, okay? And I remember processing this with a friend and telling this mentor of mine, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm having an existential crisis here. And I'll never forget, she looked me in the eye and she said, Joash, I think you know what you need to do. Over the past few weeks, your pastors have been teaching on what it means to live an integrated whole life in a divided world. So what does it mean to live an integrated whole life with God in a divided world? Number one, to live an integrated whole life is to draw closer to people in oppression. To draw closer to people in oppression. You see, Jesus drew closer to people in oppression by literally taking on the form of an oppressed human being. A colonized Jewish Palestinian man born to a refugee family fleeing violence. Pastor Munther Ishaq is a Palestinian evangelical pastor. And here's the nativity scene at his church this past Christmas. He also went on to say this. He said, if Jesus were born today, he'd be born under the rubble in Gaza. I know that this can be deeply uncomfortable for some of our Western sensibilities, but here's what I want us to understand. To people experiencing physical violence and oppression, this Jesus is good news. The children in Ukraine and Gaza under the rubble right now, this Jesus is good news. The victims of terrorism in Israel and all over the world, this Jesus is good news. To my friend Ruby, who I just got to speak with at a Vancouver church a few months ago, who cried out in captivity, God, if you're real, get me out of here, and was rescued by IJM teams the very next morning. This Jesus is good news. Because this Jesus knows what it's like to be a victim of violence. Here's the second way that Jesus shows us how to live an integrated whole life with God. To live an integrated whole life is to have the eyes to see God among people in oppression. So a few months ago, I got to lead a team of Canadian pastors and denominational leaders on a vision trip to the Philippines, to one of our IJM offices there. And towards the end of our trip, we had the chance to meet with a group of survivor leaders. And as soon as we walked in, they started leading us in worship. These survivors then went on to share their stories with us, how they were once lost to the darkness of the online sexual exploitation of children. This horrific crime where children are forced to stand in front of cameras and they're abused online by Western perpetrators for as little as $50 an hour in ways that I'm not even going to begin to describe to you. This crime so dark that the youngest child we've ever helped rescue was 2 months old. This crime so evil that Canada is the number 4 country in the world fueling the demand for this crime, purchasing the demand for this. And this crime so prevalent that recent studies show us that 500,000 Filipino children, that's 1 in 100 Filipino children, are lost to this crime. But then they went on to share about how Jesus found them. Through an IJM team of lawyers and social workers and investigators working hard with Philippines law enforcement to find them. Backed by church partners like One Church TO here in Canada, literally funding the resources needed to go rescue them. All of this was mind-blowing, but when it was our group's turn to ask a question, we found ourselves saying, wait a second, can we talk about your faith a little bit? Because we're a bunch of pastors and church leaders, and we think that you can actually teach us something about Jesus from your experience in oppression. So please teach us. And they did. It was beautiful. Here's my third point. To live an integrated whole life is to join God in cultivating life. And Jesus laid down his life to cultivate life. In Luke chapter 24, we see a very interesting scene where two disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, the wrong direction. But even though they were walking in the wrong direction, we see Jesus joining them undercover. But they tell Jesus, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." You can almost sense the disappointment in that sentence. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. But instead, he was crucified. Maybe you resonate with that. We had hoped that moving to Toronto would be different, but instead, life is tougher than ever before. I had hoped that this job or this career, this business opportunity would be different, but instead, it was the worst decision of my life. We had hoped that the doctor's diagnosis would be different, but instead, we just have more bad news. Or maybe, like these disciples, you had hoped for something from God, and instead, you find yourself deeply disappointed in God and walking in the wrong direction because of your disappointment. Here's the beautiful thing. The God who wants us to live an integrated whole life comes down to earth to join us and to show us how to live an integrated whole life with him. But then in verse 33, they see Jesus and they get up and they start living an integrated whole life with God in the right direction. Many years ago, Jesus met me on the road to Emmaus, and he turned me around and put me on another path, a path towards an integrated whole life, focused on the needs of my oppressed neighbors. And guess what? I've never regretted it. I've never regretted it. Over the past 9 years, I've gotten to live an integrated whole life with God, with IJM in 3 different countries, and I have seen some crazy things. In one city in the Philippines that I got to visit last year, we saw child sex trafficking reduce by 86%. 86%. And just last year, IJM closed an office in the city in South Asia that I'm from, after reducing child sex trafficking by 80%. The things that God does in and through us when we live an integrated whole life is mind-blowing.